Want to be in the know on all things cannabis? You're in the right place. Regulations, growing, running the business.
I need $1.
Welcome to the $1 Pound Podcast. Here are your hosts, industry professionals, Ryan and Joey.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the $1 Pound Podcast. This is Joey and Ryan, and we have a special guest today, a friend and a colleague of mine. His name is Kieran Ringgenberg. Hopefully I got your last name right. I didn't ask you before we started.
You got it.
Kieran is someone that I've been working with for the past 2 years, on several different projects. Usually we have folks or businesses or properties that are in the cannabis industry, and either they work with Kieran or maybe he works with the tenant and me, the landlord, or vice versa. So we've worked together on several different things and continue to, and I appreciate you coming on today to chat with Ryan and I about all things cannabis.
My great pleasure. Let's geek out.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for the record, anybody that has actually listened to our podcast, we apologize. We've been gone for quite a long time. Both Ryan and I are very busy with many different projects, but we found a new way to do this. And I think we're going to be knocking these out much more often than we have in the past, because I think there's many times that I know I speak to people in the industry, and I'm always thinking, damn, this would be a great podcast. So we just have to really stay on top of it, and we plan on doing that in the future. That being said, I kind of want to just start with you, Kieran, kind of for people that don't know who you are, maybe give people a little background into how long have you been an attorney? Why did you decide to become an attorney, and kind of how that journey started for you?
Wow, that's going back a ways. So I graduated from law school in 1999. I decided to be a lawyer because I was in college with a philosophy degree, and I was like, I need a job. What do I do? It seemed like the best path for me. I did competitive debate in high school and college. That was kind of my thing, and it was a very natural path. So I signed up as a lawyer. I spent, I think 17 years doing, working at a couple of different large law firms, primarily one, but a big law firm representing very large companies in litigation. And then in 2015, I spent a couple of months in Las Vegas on a trial, doing a trial for a very large U.S. tech company. And after coming home from that and seeing my kids for the first time in 2 or 3 months, I decided I didn't want to do that again. And so I set out to try to find a new thing. And so I landed in the cannabis industry. I don't do that exclusively, but it's definitely my primary focus now. And it's been a lot of fun. I like my clients a lot better. They're a lot more fun. And we have a whole bunch of interesting problems to try to solve all the time, which I enjoy a lot.
So how long have you been involved in cannabis?
I started in earnest in 2016 when the Medical Regulation Act had just passed, but before there were regs, and it was pretty clear at that point Prop 64 was going to happen. That's when I got started. I think I first had my first real client, I think, in the second half of 2016, and been working on it ever since.
Very cool. And just because it has been such a long time since Ryan and I have done this podcast, I just want to do a brief kind of review of what's happened since really the July 1st testing regulations came online. Essentially what happened the second half of 2018 was the non-emergency regulations were extended to the end of the year. And around, I think it was January 16th was when they called them the non-permanent regulations were implemented, which are the regulations we're more or less stuck with. Obviously there'll be changes, but for the most part, these are the regs that we have. So on January 16th is when they kicked in, and that's when everyone has now been, that's what everyone has now been following. What has it been like for you seeing, your clients who are going through these regulations, trying to run their businesses? What has it been like in the past 6 months, we'll say, since we're basically halfway through 2019? What are some of the challenges or issues that they've been facing?
The regulations I think the regulations themselves, it's been a little chaotic, but not too bad. I think the two issues that have the most trouble with, or my clients who I've most struggled with helping people understand and deal with, is the transition from temporary licenses to provisional and annual licenses, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, because it's really kind of the big thing happening in the industry right now. At least that's kind of my point of view on it. And the second is the BCC's decision to be more clear and about the limits on doing deals with non-licensed companies. I think that's been a major area of focus for a lot of my clients about how to do brand launches for someone that doesn't have a license, or how to, if you're a license holder, how to do deals with folks who don't have a license for IP, brand names, or whatever else you're going to do. Those have been two areas where there's been a lot of confusion arising out of the January regs, and that we've spent a lot of time on. I guess the other thing maybe that's been a big focus lately is labeling. There's this issue percolating where CDPH made it clear to everyone that they want their warning sticker on the actual vape cartridge, and that's been a big surprise to a lot of folks, and so that's certainly caused a lot of consternation. It's quite clear what they want and when they want it, which is now, but that's something else that I certainly caught some people by surprise. When I read the regs, I didn't think that's what they meant, but that's what CDPH says, so that's kind of what you got to do now.
I don't think that anybody read the regulations to be that way. I think that CDPH was pretty much the only person to interpret it that way, so it was a surprise for the entire industry. And I will say, I know that Amy Jenkins and CCIA, I believe, is working on a bill, I think it's AB 1529, which will hopefully modify those regulations to allow folks to etch the logo or the symbol onto the cartridges, and would allow it to also be white, not just black on a white background, and also lower the size, decrease the size to 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch rather than 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. So I think that it's better than nothing. But it's still going to be kind of frustrating. I've also heard from some people that say, people who work with China much more than I do, that I guess there's some concern about having that logo, and some Chinese manufacturers are either not willing to do it, or someone's voiced concerns about customs, saying, I don't know, that you can't get it in because it has that logo, or there's something about the logo and customs in China that has been an issue with some people in the past. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone really wants to do the ugly stickers that most people are using right now. So it's certainly better to do some kind of etching or printing. But yeah, I haven't heard that concern, but it doesn't make sense to me that might be problematic for people.
And I think it opens up an opportunity, the etching. If you're a manufacturer of the actual cartridge hardware, I mean, if you can just etch it for people and they could buy it pre-etched, it's going to save.
I agree. I think that's right. It's funny, I've done a lot of label review for people to try to make sure their packaging and labeling is compliant for various products, and it never made sense to me that they require black on a white background. Like, if you have a black package, why can't you just print it in white? It's clear that way. It's easier to understand. There's no real issue about it being clear. It seems to me, when we go through the next round of revisions, I may suggest to them that they make the standard that the warning label has to be clear and high contrast, but it could be black on white, or white on black, or red on black, or whatever. As long as it's clear, that seems to me the most important thing. I don't know why they're fixated on black on a white background when on a dark package that actually makes it harder to read, harder to be clear.
Yeah, I guess we'd have to dive into the statement of reasons to figure that out, but that's a good question. I'm not sure why they did that either.
I don't think it's something they considered carefully. I think it's just that, that I think it just happened. And, that's the kind of thing they should fix when they go back, and I expect that I don't know if they'll fix that particular issue, but my sense from the regulators generally is they want to try to make this workable and effective and focus on what's important. But it's, you got to live with the regs as they're written for the time being. And so right now it's, black on white. So if you have a white background, you have the black background, you have to, print the white outline around it so that you can actually see it. It doesn't really make a lot of sense.
No. And I wanted to ask you what, you kind of touched on it earlier about the transition of temporary licenses to permanent licenses, or annual or provisional licenses. And I wanted to know kind of what has your experience been with some of these state agencies and going through the licensing process, I guess in particular CDFA, since I think that's the major one that's been a point of contention when it comes to temp to provisional or annual. And of course, I'm not saying we were going to sit here and bash them. I know their job is very difficult to get through all of this, but I'm just curious what your experience has been.
Yeah. Well, so my experience is for temporary license holders, CDPH and BCC have managed to really keep up. And so I haven't had anyone who had a BCC or CDPH license who had a temporary license who submitted an annual whose temporary expired before the provisional got granted, as long as you were working with a licensing agent to get them what they needed. And they've taken a lot of different positions in different cases, but my general feeling of their policy in force at this point, at the BCC and the CDPH, is if they think you're moving forward in good faith and getting them what they want, they'll give you a provisional, as long as they don't see a deal killer that's going to prevent you from getting an annual. For example, if they don't like your diagram and they want you to make some changes, they're not going to hold up your provisional over that if you're going back and forth with them to try to get it right. And so I think as a result, almost all of the temp license holders who submitted annuals for BCC and CDPH have provisionals at this point, or will over the next few weeks. CDFA has, I think largely because they have a much bigger job, there's a lot more licenses in that category than the other two. I think have struggled to keep up with the workflow. So a tremendous number of people who submitted complete annual applications, in my view, complete annual applications, had their temporary licenses expire before their annual licenses or provisionals have been granted. In some cases, I've had I've had CDFA issue a deficiency notice and grant a provisional at the same time, which means someone looked at the file and said, we have some issues, here's some things you need to work on, but in the meanwhile, we'll give you a provisional. I've had 2 of those instances for clients. In other cases, they just won't grant the provisional until you address whatever their concerns are. And so that's one issue that's held people up, although that's a pretty small set. I mean, the bigger issue is there's just a bunch of licenses pending that they just haven't gotten to. And so the attempt's expired, the provisional is just sitting there, typically under scientific review. You can't really get any read on where they're at or what's wrong, and they get to it when they get to it. And then meanwhile, the operator is in this limbo where technically their license is expired, but they don't want to shut down the business because, if they literally had to kill other plants, then they're probably just out. They're probably just have to nuke everything and walk away. Most people are unwilling to do that. And so, there's definitely out there some folks who are operating in this limbo where maybe they're not selling anything, but they're continuing to operate their facility and waiting until their provisional comes through. It's not a great place to be, and it's been very frustrating for everyone. I think if I have a criticism of the CDFA in this, I know they're overworked, and I appreciate that. If I have a criticism of the CDFA, it would be that they haven't been transparent and frank about the situation that they're in. I was having a conversation with a CDFA agent about this exact problem. I was doing an inspection with him on behalf of one client, and I was asking this agent, like, hey, what can you tell us about the folks who have their annuals in, but there's just no action and their temps expired? Do you guys have guidance for us, or what can we do to move things along? And he said, well, it's not really a problem. The only people for whom that's true are people we've acted, but they haven't paid their fees. I'm like, that's just not correct. That's just not right. And I assume either he was misinformed about that at the agency or was, speaking the party line. So that if I have a criticism, that's what it is. As I think you guys know, there was a bill pending in the state legislature that would have extended temporaries. And my understanding is the CDFA was opposed to that because they didn't think there was a need, because they were saying we're doing fine. That was a little frustrating. There may be good policy reasons not to extend the temps, but it just was not the case that they were managing to keep up. Because I definitely have clients who submitted full, complete annuals last year who still haven't gotten acted on, or submitted them several months in advance of when their temps expired, but still haven't been acted on, and even today. And that's, obviously it's very frustrating, and I don't think it's any fault of the client. I think the problem is they're overworked and they haven't been able to keep up, and it's just an unfortunate situation. That said, I think I'm hopeful that they have a backlog. They have, there were 12,000 or 13,000 temporary applications submitted at year end, and they're churning through all those. And my hope is that once they churn through this backlog, then they'll be able to keep up. One of the big questions I have is for a brand new license submitted today, like what's the review time going to be? And I don't know. I actually just submitted a bunch this morning for one client. I'm curious to see how long it's going to take before they get acted on. Like this one's complete. They have local authorization. They have SEQA approval. They have everything. Is it going to be 3 months? Is it going to be 6 months? Is it going to be 9 months? Who knows? I'm really curious to see.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually have a client who we applied for. He never had a temp, so he's fresh. We applied March 30th, and it took about 3 months to hear back. And the first thing we heard back was he had listed someone as a secretary on his statement of information. So they said that this person should have been listed as an owner on the application, which is technically true when you read the regulations. But, the guy at the time wasn't really thinking about that. He just kind of listed the guy as a secretary, not realizing that would qualify him as an officer. So we had to change that. Now we've gotten back to them, but you know how that kind of works. They kind of find something that's wrong, tell you to fix it, and then don't really give you anything else until you fix it, as opposed to giving you like a list of things to fix. It's kind of one at a time, it seems like.
My understanding of their process, and I only know this not from any inside information, but just interacting with them on behalf of clients, is they divide up the application into parts. And so there's someone that does the owner review, there's someone that does seek review, there's someone that does a review of the leases and entitlement to the property, there's someone that does the diagrams, and they do them sequentially typically. And so if you have an issue with one, it's not that the other people are working in parallel, like they're waiting until the other thing gets resolved. And since they're overworked, I kind of understand that they don't want to like waste the other people's time until you get through the first hurdle. But at the same time, it's like you could be sitting there in limbo for weeks while you're in the queue for one of these reviewers, and maybe someone else could has the bandwidth to spend time on it and solve one of the other boxes. But because of the way they're sequencing them, to my understanding, you're just held up. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's going as slow as it is. But that experience you have is consistent. The big holdup for the vast majority of the temp license holders that I have is scientific review, and they look at water board, fish and game, and the diagrams as like the primary areas where we have focus. I mean, fish and game and water board are very straightforward about what's required, and either you have it or you don't, or you're in process. The diagrams is just a constant like battle of them. Different agents require different things, or they read the regs differently and they ask you for different things. So that's been a huge source of frustration and a lot of churning of work just to get the diagrams like they want them to show. Often, in my opinion, the differences they're asking for are really not important. They don't serve important public policy goals. Shouldn't be where their attention is focused. But hey, if they want it, we give it to them. But if I had to design a system, I would not spend 80% of the effort on these issues that are very small while, ignoring much more significant issues out there. Like, for example, getting people on track and trace. Not that they're ignoring track and trace, but like if you spend a month going back and forth on diagrams and someone that doesn't have their provisional, so they're not on track and trace in that time, it's like, does that really make sense? I think we'd rather have them on track and trace from a policy point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something we're going to definitely talk about today is Metrc and the track and trace system. That's a huge, when we talk about what it's going to be like the next 6 months of this year, that's a huge topic. And I just wanted to add, since we were talking about annuals and temps, we had posted something on our Instagram page that came courtesy of Jackie McGowan when she was at the UCBA conference down in Southern California. And I guess the different agencies had released this information. CDPH, and this was June 21st, so I'm sure this has changed, but CDPH had said they'd issued 128 annuals, 550 provisionals, 300 applications were awaiting payment. CDFA had 226 annuals, 1,662 provisionals, 661 awaiting payment, and BCC had 42 annuals, 953 provisionals, 693 awaiting payment. To your point earlier about people that are, waiting to get their provisionals based on payment. So I think there's some truth to that. I don't think it's completely the entire reason, like they kind of make it sound. I think it is a big reason though, because I think the environment in which this legal industry started through a temporary license process was not a very good indicator of what it's actually going to look like when it's all said and done and the dust settles, because it was pretty easy to get a temp. It didn't cost you any money really to get a temp, at least at the state level. Maybe locally you had things to do, but everybody was getting temps left and right, and it was kind of creating like a inflated market, so to speak. And now I think we're starting to see that market adjust pretty dramatically now that everyone has to pay to get their licensing, and now that everybody has to go through kind of the full gamut to be a licensed operator. And with that, I've seen, I don't know if you've seen it, I've seen the price dramatically shift. And, we are the $1 pound podcast because Ryan and I both believe that one day this will be like any other industry, and cannabis will become more and more of a commodity. But a lot of people are probably like, haha, not even anywhere near a $1 pound at this time, because the price has gone up pretty dramatically. I think in 2016, a lot of these farms were able to, like, when I say farms, I mean light depth greenhouses, specifically in Monterey County, were able to sell a lot of their product for Anywhere from $1,300 to $1,400 a pound was pretty normal. And then the price seemed to go down to, I don't know, maybe about $1,000, sometimes $900, $1,100, probably through the end of 2017 and 2018. And now the price has gone back to what it was in 2016. You know, a lot of people are able to sell their stuff for $1,400, $1,500, maybe even $1,600 for light dep. And indoor has certainly gone up, and indoor growers are doing much better than they were 2 years ago. And I do think a big reason for that is the temporary licenses that have gone away. People that are waiting to get licensed, like you said, a lot of farms are basically just sitting there with probably a lot of product just waiting to be sold. So it's a pretty interesting time in cannabis to see these price fluctuations and see how the regulations and the regulators are affecting the market.
I would like to point this one thing out, though. What are they making, though, for those pounds? Because even if you're selling them at what the old rates were a couple of years back, how much profit margin is actually left for these people, considering a lot of them, you know, they came from the black market to begin with, and there were no taxes and there weren't any of these permitting fees. So, I mean, are these farms making the kind of money that they could have 2-3 years ago?
No. I don't think anyone would think at this point that you could make more money in the legal market than in the black market with the same operation. I don't think anyone would tell you that. The idea, you know, but it's obviously a better business in the long run to be in the legal market, but definitely right now, I think a lot of people are struggling to pay for the improvements that are required to go through the licensing process. I mean, Joey and I both work a lot with folks in Monterey County, and, you know, like the county is requiring a ton of facility improvements to keep people moving forward through the licensing process. That's expensive. Even though Monterey County lowered the taxes on cultivators from what they once were for a time, they're still, you know, it's still a big obligation. There's the state cultivation tax you got to take out. So I think a lot of people are struggling. I think one of the reasons that provisionals aren't getting paid for is because people want to wait till the last minute because they can't afford it. They just don't have the cash. And if you have a big operation, you know, the license fees are quite significant. Obviously, you know, a small tier 2 is is what, 23 grand. And if you have, you know, whatever, a stack of those, as much as the bigger operators in Monterey County do, you're well into hundreds of thousands of dollars just for the annual licensing fee, which is a huge amount of cash to come up with on short notice, especially. So I mean, I agree with your point, Ryan. It's not fat living out there for the cultivators. Even though the price is up, it's still a struggle. I will say, I think one other reason that the price is up is because some areas in the state are doing enforcement on the unlicensed grows, and there is a relationship between the illicit market price and the licensed market price. And as the supply of material on the illicit market shrinks, then the price of everything goes up. I do think that's a fact, and I think the people in the industry would largely acknowledge that.
Kieran,
yeah.
I have another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
While we're going through this hyper overregulated transitional phase, do you imagine that once this actually does, because in November 2020, when the election comes up, pretty much every Democratic candidate, for the most part, is probably going to come out in support of either some form of decriminalization or legalization for marijuana across the federal level, which means basically descheduling it or possibly rescheduling it. If that actually happens, do you see all of this basically, like, if you could design the perfect system, what would you want it to actually look like, at least at the state level? Should it all go under one department? Should it go under like BCC? Or is it smarter to have it still broken up into these multiple departments? And then also, do you eventually see a future where, for example, the permitting is about as difficult as just getting an alcohol permit if you're a convenience store or a CVS or a pharmacy, et cetera? Like, what would you actually like to see as far as a good and a stable model going forward in like the next 2 to 6 years?
I think it's highly unlikely that in the 2 to 6 year window, we're going to see major changes that make it as easy as alcohol to get licensing or that make it substantially less regulated. I mean, my best read is that as I look at the prospects for federal legalization, what I think is likely to happen first is banking reform, because there's no good policy argument, in my opinion, for maintaining a system that says we're going to allow states to do this but we're going to make all the operators operate in cash. It makes no sense. It's bad for public policy on a number of levels, just the safety of moving cash around, the logistics of having state and local governments like collect these massive quantities of cash. And if you're trying to actually collect taxes from the industry, having everything done in cash is like the worst possible way to handle it. So I suspect that will come first. I hope maybe that'll happen this year. I don't know. I think the next step would probably be some kind of codification of the current policy we have in place, which is just the feds will keep their hands off of it. And we've had that through the budget bills, but that's really stopgap. I suspect the first thing we pass at the federal level is just something that says like the States Act that says, hey, if it's legal under the states, we're not going to go after you. Not out of a budget constraint like the Warbacher amendments that have been passed in the past, but as a matter of substantive law, it's no longer illegal. And then we'll probably get some kind of actual federal legalization with almost certainly there's going to be some level of federal regulation. I don't think it's realistic that they're just going to deschedule it and walk away. I think that's extremely unlikely. I think you're going to have some kind of federal licensing program with a transition period, probably some social equity component. Certainly the Democrats that I know, that I understand their policies on cannabis would almost certainly have some social equity requirements as part of the program. So, and I'm guessing that's years out, probably after the next administration. That's my best guess. I could be wrong, but that's what my guess. At the state level, Prop 64 is passed by the voters and has the licensing regime in it. And so to make substantial changes, to really sweep it out, we have to pass another ballot initiative. I mean, they can tinker at the edges through the legislature, but to make wholesale changes, I really think we need a new ballot measure. For example, if we're going to make licensing super easy, like licensing is for hemp, for example, which is very straightforward, I think we'd have to go back and do another ballot measure. And I don't know what the prospect of that is in California. My guess is probably not very likely anytime soon. Now, if you want to ask me how I would do it if it was up to me, I honestly, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it is helpful to have 3 agencies regulating. I think that was a political compromise. I think it makes it inefficient. I think it's a resource allocation problem. I think, if the BCC was running everything, my guess is this would all move a lot smoother. But that said, CDFA is the agriculture expert, so it certainly makes sense to have them in charge of the cultivators. But I do think, because BCC was started from scratch and CDFA was bolting on the Cal Cannabis operation onto an existing regulatory structure, I think that's part of the reason for why CDFA has struggled a little bit with their job as compared to BCC. It's also a bigger job to do, and there's no question about that. So I don't mean to malign them, but if I had it to do over, I think I'd just have one regulator for the whole industry, which is how most of the other states have done it. I definitely would. I think the other major problem, which we haven't talked about at all, which I think we should talk about, other major problem with California is local control. We have a system where every state and every city and county gets to set their own rules for cannabis. And that creates a whole second level of regulatory morass. And in particular, most places just say no. I mean, I think they say 3/4 don't allow anything of the counties and cities. And in my opinion, for cultivation, manufacturing, it doesn't really make too much difference because there's enough places that allow cultivation to meet the needs of the state and ultimately for export once that's allowed under the federal system. I think for retail, it's proven to be a huge problem because there's not enough retail stores that are licensed. And it's very hard to get local governments to approve them. I've been involved in at least 2 jurisdictions where they decided to go ahead and allow licensing, but then changed their mind and either radically changed the rules or just decided not to do it altogether. And because of public pressure from opponents of cannabis, which I think are misguided on a public policy level, distribution is somewhere in the middle. We don't need a distributor in every city, but we do need distributors in every region. And so that's solvable in the current system. It's not as bad as retail, but it is, I think, still in play as a problem. So that's, if I had to fix one thing about our system, it would be to simplify local control, cap the tax rates that localities can charge, prohibit them from enacting regulations that fundamentally make it difficult to operate in each area that are either inconsistent with or radically in excess of the state regulations. If I could, I would entirely take away their ability to prohibit these operations, other than maybe zoning approval within some reasonable limits. I think that is the number one problem in our state system, is not the state level regulatory apparatus, it's the locals. That's my opinion.
Would you want to do something along the lines as far as not even just capping the local taxes, which are nothing more than sin taxes really, but actually just straight up, it's just at the point of sale and it goes to the state level? That's it, like the way some of the other states do? Or is that doesn't give enough incentive for locals to turn things on?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. If I had my druthers, I would get rid of local taxes altogether and just have a single taxation, at retail, or maybe on cultivation too. I think that's a fine in prospect to collect at cultivation and at retail, which is the state system, and just get rid of all the local taxes out of it. But as you say correctly, because we have local control, the primary incentive for locals to turn on cannabis licensing is for the tax revenue. And so that requires them to have the ability to collect tax revenue. So if we're going to have local control, they need to have the ability to get the local taxes as the incentive to allow licensing. But the problem we have in our current system is compounding, where every locality is charging taxes. And especially when they do a gross receipts tax, which is how many of them have operated, as a product moves through the supply chain, the taxes add on top of each other, and the cumulative compounded tax rate is just extremely high. And I think that's a major reason why we haven't seen our legal market do as well as we might have hoped by this point from a sales point of view. It's the cumulative tax burden.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, because the taxes are so high, the operators are doing backflips to try to find ways to minimize their tax burden, with creative corporate structures and different transaction deals. And I don't really think that's in anyone's interest. I spend a lot of my time trying to help people appropriately and legally minimize their local tax burden. And that's a waste of time. It doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't generate anything for consumers. And so if we had a more simpler system, we could be focused on stuff that's probably more important from a public policy point of view.
I do agree with you on the local control side. I think when we talk about running a new initiative to try to fix a lot of these things, that's going to be the biggest challenge we face no matter what, because if you try to run an initiative eliminating local control or taking away their local control, you're going to have so many people, so many enemies against that. And that's going to be the biggest challenge to fix anything with an initiative, by far. And just so you know, Ryan, and I guess Kieran as well, I actually started a bullet point checklist of what I would change if we had a magic wand and we could fix Prop 64. And I've talked to several different people about it, and I'll share that with both of you, so that we can continue to build upon it. It's completely utopian and probably not very likely at all, but it makes me feel good inside when I look at it and try to think maybe one day.
If we could just get enough retail shops, I think it would solve most of the problem. I think that would go so far if we could just get enough retail shops. I know there was a bill in front of the legislature to kind of require a bunch of locals to have retail. I guess I wasn't ever optimistic that was going to pass. I'm not sure that's the right way. But if we could just get enough locals to authorize them, I do think that would go so far to solving many of our problems.
Actually, Joey, a lot of the states that still haven't fully turned on could probably use the perfect utopian, idealistic, this is how you should do it so you don't screw it up like every other state out there and just pick and choose the best stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's a good idea.
Yeah. I'll share that with you and we can expand upon it. But you're right. Yeah. If we can maybe at least save some other states from going through this, then it'd be helpful for the people that deal with cannabis there. One question I had for you, Kieran, was, related to, you talked about clients doing backflips and trying to find ways to lower their tax burden. And, so I think especially in the retailers, a lot of people give the retailers a lot of heat because they think they're making a ton of money, but they have a lot of taxes they have to pay, and they have a lot of stuff they have to do. And one topic that's come up, I think in the past week or two, was MJ Biz Daily came out with an article about slotting fees, about which are basically fees that retailers are charging to vendors for shelving space. Sometimes it's any shelf space. Sometimes it's very particular shelf space. And I did a lot of research into it after I read the article, and I knew about slotting fees, but I'd never really paid much attention to them until the article came out. And what I found was interesting about them is that it's illegal to do that in alcohol. You can't do slotting fees in alcohol. I'm sure people do some backdoor deals or find ways around the rule, but it's illegal to do that. But it is legal to do in tobacco, and it's very common to do in grocery stores. And I'm just curious, if you read that article or if you have seen this with any clients you work with, or if you think it's going to be something that continues to happen. Is it going to be the norm in cannabis? I think it may continue to happen because, again, when we talk about taxes and we talk about retailers trying to find ways to counteract all their expenses, if you can find a new revenue stream through slotting fees, I mean, why wouldn't you do it?
I think that I have seen this happen in the industry. I'm aware of it. My feeling is that you have a lot of well-funded brands who their primary problem is getting shelf space at dispensaries because there's a lot of people competing for shelf space. And because there's no, in many industries, if you're trying to get a new consumer product off the ground, you're like, the goal is to get picked up by Target or Walmart or, wherever you're trying to get. But if you get one of those deals, you're kind of at critical mass. And that doesn't exist in the cannabis industry. Like as far as I know, the single largest group of retailers that are controlled by the same people is like under 20 out of what do we have 800 in the state at this point, something like that. So it's very hard to get coverage. You have people who are willing to spend a lot of money to grow their brand. There are limited opportunities for advertising because of legal restrictions, but more primarily because a lot of the advertisers just won't carry the product because of the federal legal system, or just won't carry advertising on the product because of the federal legal system. So if you have all this money to spend to get your brand out there and you've saturated available advertising and you're already doing all these events, which is kind of a way people spend a lot of money, what else is left? Well, just pay the retailer to carry the product. Definitely people are selling their product at very low prices to grow, even though that's leaving them not making much money. That's definitely happening. But even ancillary to that is slotting fees, which pay the retailer to allocate shelf space to your product. I think it's going to happen unless the BCC steps in and says it's not allowed, which I haven't seen any indication that they will. I expect it will continue. I will say one thing, which is the regs prohibit anyone from selling product below cost. And if the slotting fee is big enough, I think I would think the right way to read the regs is that the slotting fee is essentially a discount off the sales price. And so if you looked at the combined price for the product plus the slotting fee and you make it be below price, I think that would be a regulatory violation. So if you were an existing brand that was getting forced out by these, that might be an avenue you could take with the regulators or potentially even litigation to pursue that. It's funny, in my previous life, one of the things I did a lot of work on was antitrust, which deals with anti-competitive practices by people with large market shares to undercut their competition, and this has been an issue. These types of arrangements have been issues. So there was actually a big piece of litigation involving Philip Morris. This is about a decade ago that I wasn't involved in, but I saw, which involved their relationships with retailers to secure prominent locations at retail stores for Philip Morris brands, and they got sued by some of the smaller tobacco brands to challenge those on an antitrust theory. So it wouldn't surprise me if we ended up there in this industry, although at this point, there's no dominant players, I don't think, or very few dominant players. No one really, I think, has a dominant market position where they're using their market size to exclude competitors. I haven't seen that yet. It could happen. There definitely are a few brands that are bigger than others, but that's something I certainly have my eyes on.
I was curious, since you brought that up, that you had that experience, do you have any idea why it's illegal in alcohol, but it's not in tobacco or grocery stores?
I'm going to assume, I don't know, I'll speculate, it's dangerous, but I'm going to speculate that it relates to our 3-tiered model for alcohol distribution, and they don't want to give any distributor too much control over what consumers see at retail. That's going to be my guess. It's much more heavily regulated than as far as how the business is done, and it moves through the supply chain than other industries. And so I assume it's an artifact of that. situation. As I understand it, essentially in most places, a small number of alcohol distributors control huge parts of the market. So if you allowed sliding fees, it'd be really, really hard to have a competitive market in that situation.
And I think, when we talk about potentially CPC or somebody regulating sliding fees, I think it's interesting to know that Lori Ajax does come from the alcohol industry. So I'm sure she's all too familiar with them, and I'm not sure where she stands on it, but it'll be interesting to see if this comes up in the future, if it does become a problem. And kind of to take it back a little bit to what Ryan was touching on about, maybe some profit that people were making in the black market before regulations to the profit that they're making or not making now.
I'm sorry. Did you say black market? I think you meant the Prop 215 market, didn't you?
Oh yeah, free market. What I think is interesting when we talk about things like slotting fees is really, like you said, that the intention is for these new companies that are coming in that don't have an established brand, that want to get on shelf space, and that are really only focused on market share. That's the big topic I want to touch on is market share. They don't really care if they're making a profit right now, because many of them, their strategy is solely market share and not on profit in any way, shape, or form. And I'm curious if you think like what, eventually these investors, I think some of the investors understand what they're doing. They're like, yeah, go get market share. When will we see these investors shift their mindset and say, okay, now we actually have to start making money. Now we've gotten market share. Now we have to find a way to make profit.
Would it be when they make the market share percentage that they want? I mean, if you got like 50% of the market, you just suddenly, okay, time to start making money and stop expanding.
That may be right, but I think the long-term goal for most of these players is to establish a brand for the national market that will eventually happen once we have federal legalization. And so until that happens, I think it's all growth. And a lot of what's driving this is the M&A activity that's happening, where these mostly Canadian public companies are gobbling up. The MSOs are rolling them up in many cases. The transaction values are based on revenue, not on profits. And so they don't care about the bottom line. They only care about the top line because that's how they're going to get paid. And as long as they can keep the boat from sinking, their sole focus in most cases is just to build those revenue figures, because when they get bought, it's going to be on a multiple of revenue, not a multiple of their profits. And so, the number one consideration, other than keeping the doors open, which they're going to do by continuing to raise money, is growing that revenue figure and building a brand that they think can survive nationally. Different people have different business models, but I assume in the long run, that's the biggest players. That's what they're focused on, having a nationwide leading brand in 2025 or 2028 or whenever we get to a national market. And look, we're getting there. Okay, so we have, Chicago, Illinois is going online with rec. I think presumably New York and New Jersey are going to go there soon. You're going to have these MSOs. They're going to have the same brand in all these places. And so they're positioning themselves, for that national market, not necessarily even when we have national sales of exports from California to Illinois or New York or wherever else, but even just the MSOs having parallel production in all these places under the same brand, which you're starting to see. So my guess is no time soon, as far as when they try to turn the corner and start making money. The other thing I would point to is my background was working before I turned to cannabis. I worked with a lot of companies in the technology space, and definitely the early stage companies were just continuing to build until they dominated. That was their goal. Their goal was to spend and not make a dollar, continue to lose massive amounts of money until they were dominant enough in their industry. Then they could turn the corner and start generating profits once they had a dominant position. So you could look at Amazon's history and see, it was only recently that they started actually making money, because at that point they were the unquestioned leader in their field. And I don't think that there's room for 15 different market dominating firms in cannabis. And so I don't know how many people are going to try to get to that position, but I certainly think they're going to try to get the position of having a strong nationwide brand before they start trying to capitalize on their investments and start generating revenue.
And just for the sake of anyone listening who may not know, especially in this world of overused acronyms. Can you let people know what an MSO is or what that stands for?
Multi-state operator. So that's the folks who have, the typical model is you have the same brand that's operating in multiple states, and because you're not allowed to transport product from one state to the other, you just have licensed operations in each state where you typically, say you're going to produce the same edibles using the same formula, but you produce it at facilities in each state where you offer the product. You get the same thing with flower, a little bit different, but same idea. Cresco is a big one. They're getting a lot of prominence lately. Harvest out of Arizona is another one. So there's, that's the model.
Yeah. And speaking of, you touched on technology and having experience in the technology field. Technology that we're all getting used to right now is Metrc. A lot of people with, what comes with getting your provisional or annual license is having to get onto the Metrc system. And, I guess in a perfect world, we were all supposed to be on this at the beginning of 2018 or at some point in 2018, but it didn't quite work out that way. So here we are halfway through 2019 with the market just starting to get onto Metrc. And I think mostly it's cultivators getting into it because, they're catching up now with the temporary licenses. It's certainly manufacturers and distributors because BCC is pretty on top of it. And I think the last folks to really get on it, from what I've seen, is probably going to be retailers, because from what I've seen, most retailers' temporary licenses expire somewhere in August, give or take. So obviously people will have some time from when they first get their provisional or annual to actually getting in Metrc and actually tagging the product. But what do you see in the next 6 months when it comes to this transition of going from basically paper records, if people kept them at all, they're supposed to, but let's be honest, to, this robust, or not robust, depending on who you talk to, Metrc system? I mean, what do you predict?
When I'm working with my clients to help them get on Metrc, there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of chaos and it's going to be a bumpy road. I think that people are trying hard, but even trying hard, it's still really confusing about how it's supposed to work. I think there's a few factors there. So one is that the Metrc system, the backbone of the Metrc system was developed in these other states that had much different systems than us. So, and I think the thing that I see causing most problems is we cap the size of cultivation licenses. So as you guys know, but I'll say for anyone who doesn't understand this, is, a company can have a single license, a single medium license, which for indoor or greenhouse is 22,000 square feet of flowering canopy, and then an unlimited number of 10,000 square feet licenses. And so the bigger operations have, 5, 10, 20 different cultivation licenses. And so their operations involve moving product from a nursery license to one of these many flowering cultivation licenses to a processing license, is the typical workflow of the larger operations. And the Metrc system does accommodate that, but it clearly was not designed for that. And so it's figuring out how to do those transfers within one company or within a series of related companies has been a challenge. So it's something we're working on with a number of folks to try to make sure we get it right. I think the other thing is the existing software platforms that were imported from other states that interfaced with Metrc in, say, Oregon and Washington. They don't have those frameworks. So to do that in California, like the systems have to be adjusted to address that. And I've heard mixed reports about the various third-party softwares out there to the degree to which they support how the actual business is done in California under our regulatory system. So I see that as an issue. I was going to say, with regard to timing, I think you're right about retailers maybe being last, but I will say that in the last week or so, I've gotten a number of comments from BCC with regard to certain clients where they say, hey, you're approved for a provisional. If you don't pay by next week, we're going to cancel it. And so they're making them flip on their provisional, even though the temp may last another month or two. And so I think they're trying to get everyone in the system. That's my read on what they're doing there. They're trying really hard. My impression of what the BCC is doing is they're trying really hard to get everyone in operation onto a provisional now or very soon. So I think you're going to see everyone on the system soon. My interactions and my team's interactions with the Metrc staff has been great. They've been super helpful. They really try to do their best. I think they don't have always the answers, but they've been really responsive. especially on the phone. I think that the people are helpful and nice, and they try really hard, which I really commend. And I appreciate, but I haven't seen yet the specialized training for each license type that they have said they're going to provide. So, there's a general training for everybody, which is very general, but to my knowledge, unless it's come out in the last couple of days, they have not launched this specific training for cultivators, specific training for distributors, specific training for manufacturers, because the workflow for all of them is quite a bit different, and we need to see that. And that's why we're just having to figure this stuff out, because there's not a clear playbook on how this goes. So, my guess is for the next few months, there's going to be chaos as people try to get on the system. And my understanding of the BCC has been pretty understanding with people who make mistakes, learning the system, getting their inventory on, because it's natural that there are going to be some, even though people are trying their best to do what's required. But I think after a period of kind of a grace period where, some allowance for mistakes, for reasonable mistakes is made, I assume you're going to see clamping down, and as all the temps, and eventually all the temps are out, right? So the last temps expire in August. So no one, past August should be doing transactions other than on Metrc. And that's going to close a big, I don't want to say loophole, but a big black spot. Because right now, say a lot of distributors and retailers are not on Metrc. So, you may have a cultivator on Metrc who transfers to a distributor who's not on Metrc, who transfers to a retail manufacturer who is on Metrc, who transfers back to a distributor who's off Metrc, and then to a retailer's off Metrc. And so you have certain transactions that show up on Metrc, but they're not all connected. And so once we get into August, when all the temps are gone, that should be over. And, after, I would say the latest, after mid to late August, there should be no more transfers on Metrc to unlicensed folks or people who don't have provisional annual licenses. I think that'll be a big turning point, because then you'll have to see total continuity among the transactions and to see whether they add up correctly or not, which I'm sure BCC is eager to see how well they add up.
Another thing I think we should touch on related to Metrc is, what would you recommend to people? I've talked to some folks who said, especially, we just talked about costs and margins and profit. I'm not going to pay for this expensive third-party software. I'm just going to use straight Metrc, and I'm not going to use another third party to deal with Metrc. Have you run into that? Do you recommend people do that? Do you recommend they don't do that? What's your thought?
I don't think we have enough experience to say. I would say you can think you're saving money by not getting software, but what that means is you're going to spend money on labor for manual data entry. And so, in the long run, it might be cheaper to use third-party software rather than pay someone on your staff to spend all day entering data in Metrc, which is what you're going to be doing. But I don't have experience enough to see. I have clients who are taking both approaches. They're going to keep with their homebrew system that they have and just manually enter the data into Metrc, or people that are rolling out some of these third-party software to try to make it easier. You still have to do manual stuff on Metrc regardless, but you can definitely reduce the amount of data entry that you have to do into Metrc if you have third-party software. So I think we need to operate under it for a couple months and see. I'm sure that in the long run, there's going to be third-party software that makes people's lives easier. Whether it's worth it, depends on your operation. The other thing I'll say is, my team has been trying to talk to everyone who has a licensed, approved Metrc third-party software add-on, just to see what's out there, because it's a common question we get from our clients. Hey, what's out there? What's good? So, we've been trying to figure out that. And my read is that for the retail level, there's quite a bit of different options because it's a good software product to produce, because you can basically make the retailers behave in a particular way. And make software replicable across all your customers. And that's the classic software game, is build it once and use it a million times. And that's how you can make some money. But on the cultivator, distributor, manufacturer side, I think there's a much less stable and broad base of software options available, because everyone has a different business model about how exactly their operation works. And so I know there's certainly for cultivators who only have one license, I think there's quite a bit of stuff. But for people who have these larger operations or have integrated distribution or integrated manufacturing, the reports I'm getting is that the software has to be really massaged to meet their business needs, to adjust to their business situation and their business model. And so I think that's going to be a while. I think I would love to hear from someone who's got some simple off-the-shelf, maybe open source database tools that they can bolt on to Metrc APIs and do customization for clients to meet their particular needs. I think that's where the most need is in the short term, because it's just going to be a while before we have mature software that's capable of dealing with the broad array of business models that California's licensing program creates in the different way that people do business.
Yeah, and I would say to add on to the question I asked you was, I think the most common licensee that's saying I'm just going to go with Metrc, from what I've seen, is the cultivators. And I think it's mostly because cultivators haven't really done much work with software, most of them anyway. I think distributors and retailers are used to having some sort of a software system. And I advise people to probably go with a third party. I mean, like you said, it really depends on your operation and how large or small you are. But for the most part, at the end of the day, what's important to keep in mind is that Metrc is really meant for the state to track where product is, where it's going, who has it, where it came from. It's not really meant for you to run your business in the sense of generating reports and what your profit is and things like that. So that's something important to keep in mind when you decide if you want to go with just Metrc or if you want to go with a third party. Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would add on that is just Metrc isn't the solution. It's am I going to maintain my inventory and other records in my own system and then update Metrc with the transfers, or am I going to use a single piece of software to try to do both? Because even if you just use Metrc, Metric's not going to maintain your inventory. So and you have to have inventory records, obviously, not only because for regulatory reasons, but because any business needs to know what they have. And so if that, maybe it's a spreadsheet, maybe it's a notebook, fine, you could do that. I think you could manage it, but you'd have to maintain that system and update Metrc too. It's never just Metrc, because it doesn't do everything you're going to need to do to stay compliant and also just run your business.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that I found, I've been messing with Metrc in my own business now recently. And one thing that's been frustrating when we talk about using third party or not is, you touched on it earlier, the one thing that none of these third party softwares can do, and I guess it's by design, is they're not able to do the transfer part of it. The transfer part of it, you have to actually go into Metrc and basically do the transfer, right? What product you're sending to, who you're sending it to, all of that. And then that will send the data over to your third party and you could take it from there. That was certainly frustrating for me, especially from a distribution standpoint, because one of the main reasons we use our software is for sales orders and transfers out to dispensaries or for intaking product from cultivators. So it was kind of frustrating to see that we have to log into Metrc every time, do all of that, and then go back to our third party and do whatever else we have left to do. But at the end of the day, it is what it is, and we're pretty much stuck with it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that report from others as well, and I'm hopeful that in the long run, at the very least, we can make it as simple as possible, so you don't have to do a bunch of data entry, where you can just go on and approve the transfer, where everything's loaded up, and you don't have to do just data entry for everything, but you can just go on at Metrc and approve the transfer or enter the final data and approve the transfer to really save the time of typing all the stuff in over again.
Yeah, and that's what I, to speak positively about Metrc, that is one thing I think is going to be great when everyone is on Metrc. From what I've seen, you can log into Metrc and you have a full list of everyone that's on Metrc. You have their license information, you have their name, their contact information, and that's awesome, because before Metrc, we had to make sure we wrote the license number right, or there could have been a typo. So to be able to log in and just see the full list of all the licensees and select one of them is going to save a lot of time. In the interim, though, dealing with external transfers, like you said, if you're on Metrc and the temp you're selling to is not on Metrc, you have to do external transfers, and there is no way to automate that. There's no way to autofill kind of that information, and that sucks. But hopefully, we don't have to deal with that much longer. Maybe another month or so. That's good. Really, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I appreciate you coming on with us. I just really had two last questions for you, and they're pretty general questions. But one, given everything we've talked about, given where we are in the cannabis industry and where we seem to be heading, what advice do you have for people that are new that want to get into the cannabis industry? And then on the reverse side of that, what advice do you have for people that are veterans of the cannabis industry that have kind of been in it for a long time and are trying to figure out what they should do or how they should handle their endeavor?
I mean, for someone who's an entrepreneur who wants to get into the business, I would say you should be realistic about what the capital needs are to launch a successful cannabis business, because they're significant. And unless you have a very large stack of money to start with, you're going to have to go raise some money to get a business off the ground at this stage. And I think people have unrealistic expectations about that they can, on a shoestring, get something launched that's going to succeed, because in my experience, that's not going to happen. At least not if you're going to be a core business where, you're going to be a licensed operator in one of the categories. It's going to be expensive. And if you don't have the money, my advice would be, try to find an existing operator to work with and learn and see how it works before trying to launch something on your own. There are ancillary areas where someone who's not a licensed operator, I think, could do things on a more entrepreneurial basis with less of a commitment, with less financial needs, less capital needs. You have to be smart about that, but I do think there's some opportunities out there where you're servicing or helping out the licensed operators. I think there's a need in those areas. That's what my business is. I'm not a licensed operator. I help the operators out and other ancillary providers as well. So that's what I would say for the existing operators. I feel like there's a lot of people who put everything they had into a business, and they may start needing to be realistic that it's not going to make it, because the reality is that a good number of the smaller businesses are going to fail in one way or another over the next couple of years. And I don't like that, but it's a reality. And so I think if I was advising someone, I would take a hard look at what your long-term future is in the industry and try to chart a path that is realistic about where you're going to end up and what you're going to do. Whether that means, selling your business or partnering with someone else who's bigger, or whether it means shutting it down earlier before you lose more money. I think those are things that people need to talk about. Not everyone is going to fail. I'm not saying that, but I think anyone who takes a hard look at the industry, especially like the smaller scale cultivators, I don't know how realistic it is that they're all going to survive. It's not realistic they're all going to survive. They're not. A lot of them are going to fail out. And so I would just try to take a hard, sober look at what your future is and what is the right choice to make. I see something that happens a lot. People start falling behind. They're struggling. They're trying to raise money to make it work. Maybe they're continuing to take on debt, and they don't really have a path. They're just trying to keep it going because they're trying to save what they've already put in. And at some point, it might make a lot more sense to sell out and salvage things and get a little bit, partner up with someone to create a larger enterprise that has more of a prospect for the future, or just realize that you just need to pull the ripcord and move on to something else. That's a really hard discussion to have with someone that's poured their heart and soul into something, but it's even harder to have that conversation when they've literally looted every asset they have and put themselves in debt up their eyeballs that they'll never be able to work out of. Like that's a worse situation. So I wish I could. All that said, I think there's still a ton of opportunity out there for smart players who do the right thing, who make good choices. I just think that the percentage of those people in the industry right now is not as big as I wish it were.
It's pretty solid advice. Before we go, Ryan, anything else that you have to add?
No, that was beautiful, man.
Thanks, guys. Good to talk to you.
Kieran, for anybody who may listen to this, they like what you have to say, they want to hire you for some of your services, how do they get a hold of you?
Ringgenberglaw.com is our website, and our phone number's on there. You can reach us that way, and just drop us an email or give us a call, and that's the best way to get started.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for everyone that's listening to this. This has been another episode of the $1 Pound Show, and we hope you have a good one. Oh, by the way, happy 7/10 for anybody who's listening. It is 7/10, which is a stoner holiday. So take a dab for all three of us, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the $1 Pound Podcast with your hosts, Ryan and Joey, online at $1pound.com. We'll catch you next time.